Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Pettard, the host of this particular webinar. I only is in the background helping and supporting me as my producer. Before we get started, I would actually like to acknowledge the traditional land owners of the land I'm joining from, the Burley people of Liswitta, Tasmania. I'd like to acknowledge any traditional owners who are joining us today, the Aboriginal or Indigenous community. I would like to pay my respects to you, your elders, past, present, future, and emerging. Also, I just really want to acknowledge that many of you are in a spot where you're actually working from home under tight restrictions, spending lots of time doing screen timers in meetings. So thank you very much for taking the time out to do something different, particularly at this moment. And it's not an easy time to keep on doing more screen time. For people who don't know me, I'm Robin Pettard, the founder of Sprout Labs. Also, quite often I think of myself as the front person for Sprout Labs. And I'm also the host of the Learning by Working podcast. And that will come up multiple times during this particular webinar as well. A bit of a preamble to explain a little bit about what Sprout Labs does. We really work with learning platforms and enable you and your teams to author, deliver, and measure high-impact digital learning ecosystems. We sort of do two things, which is this whole platform capability thing. We almost provide people with the platforms to be able to do really amazing workplace learning, but also the capabilities and the skills to be able to design and develop really great learning, which is almost what some of this sort of type of work that we're doing today fits into that sort of space. As I just mentioned, there's a podcast to go along with this particular session, and it's actually found myself as I was doing the prep work for this, talking a lot more about design thinking than what I expected. So in actual fact, I think probably 2 years ago, I actually did a short podcast series on design thinking and L&D, and there's an ebook that goes along with that as well. There's lots of other content from Sprout Labs. There's our ebook, a past record, all the webinars, and our virtual conference recordings as well. A little bit about what we're talking about today. We're thinking sort of about sparking new ideas. As I just said, design thinking has actually ended up being a lot more of the focus of what I was talking about today than what I actually expected to be talking about as well. We're going to explore and think about some new types of brainstorming technique, a little bit on about where to find inspiration for different types of innovative approaches to learning as well. I'm not giving you solutions. I'm not sitting there thinking this is a really creative way of developing designing an e-learning module, or how about you use this approach, or how about you use that. What I'm trying to give you and work with is a mindset, first of all, a different way of thinking, and also a series of different ways of processes. So that you're at a spot where you can create your own things in a different way to what you've been doing in the past. So just be aware of that. I'm almost not providing recipes for you. I'm providing you are hopefully a foundation to be able to build your own recipes into the future. Still actually doing my Zoom guidelines, just in case there's some odd people who actually haven't ever used Zoom. You can open up your participant list and see who's here at any particular time, and open up your chat. We will be doing quite a few chat activities and a few whiteboard activities during the session as well. Please keep your microphones muted, unless, say, at the end, if we've got some time for Q&A, doing some Q&A work and chat questions as well. Just make sure when you are doing your chats that you're sending them to everyone, please, as well. Just a reminder on that. Just so I can modify things a little bit on the fly, I'd love to hear from everyone in chat. What do you want to gain from the session? What do you want to have a really nice as your takeaways from here, from this particular session? This means I can actually just modify things a little bit on the fly. I talk about possibly different examples and things as I'm going. Looking forward to seeing in chat what some of the things you want to gain from the session. Cool. Paul, you want things other than brainstorming. I wasn't expecting you. Inspiration, alternative processes, creative structures. Roots, creative starting points. Cool. You get the ideas. Overcoming, okay, yeah, David, creative blocks. Actually interesting. That was one of the things I did dive into a little bit as I was starting to think about some of this as well. Anna model and frameworks. All right, that's great. Other creative ways and ideas. Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Some things I will be able to do, some other things I probably won't be able to do as well. Cool. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thinking styles as well. Yeah. Now, we're going to do a quick whiteboard activity. And if you've never used the whiteboard activity in Zoom before, please go up to the top of the screen, I think, and go view options and go annotate. To give you a moment to do that. So you go up to the top and go to annotate. Then you have a toolbar that comes across your screen, depending on where you are, will show up. So yeah, cool. Someone's actually using one of the tools. We're going to use the stamp tool or the text tool in a few moments. And just something I keep on forgetting to remind people that with some activities we're about to actually do, if you can't use the whiteboard tool because you're not using the Zoom client, you're using the web version of it, please just respond in chat. It's one of the things I just keep on forgetting to do as well. Cool. Someone battling the dreaded online fatigue. All right. I need to actually get up my annotation tools as well, so I can clear what we're about to clear drawings before we move on to the next one. Now, I want you to make a mark somewhere on this page. So if you come from a really creative background, put your mark towards the top. If your background is in learning, down towards the bottom. Cool. It's interesting. I'm seeing some of the names go up as well. And a few people doing a learning background. Actually, we've got an interesting distribution. I thought we would possibly go more towards the learning background. Cool. Yeah, David, so you're using a browser. So if you just respond, yeah, and thank you. And driving for work is one of those moments where, yes, you can't do a whole lot of interactions while driving for things as well. But interesting as well, because I'm going to sit there and say one of the things when I was seeing people who were signing up to this, I went, this is interesting. Some of the people who signed up to it, I sat there and went, well, I don't think you need this. I think you actually come from quite a creative background yourself, based on what I know of you. So it's actually interesting we've got that distribution happening through this, because it's often that moment where people sit there and go, yes, that's actually what it comes from. So I'll do a little bit of a confession. I actually come from a total creative background. People quite often even sit there and do a whole, when they see that I've got a doctorate, they sit there and go, they expect that doctorate to be in learning. My PhD was actually in visual arts. During the first stage of my career and working career, I was a full-time artist and designer, and I moved into learning when I was working in a university, and I then actually taught design for 5 years, and that was actually how I then moved into management roles, and then moved into more start workplace learning as that. So I actually see that I quite often talk about a spot where I actually sit there and go, yeah, that I don't actually talk about it very often, because it feels like a really weird background to be doing a lot of this type of work from. Thank you, everyone. But it's interesting as well, because I think this sometimes shapes some of the ways we work with our mindsets, and some of the things we sometimes have barriers to as well. Cool. Now, workplace learning often has this engagement problem. People don't want to do it. We're trying to get them interested in a topic which isn't particularly interesting, or content that's very heavy, or something that before. It just really people keep on sort of talking about the fact that people just don't want to do it, or they don't fully really get excited about doing it. I actually think one of the reasons why we're doing this is we've actually keep on doing what we've seen in the past. We keep on copying models of existing e-learning that we've actually been working with, or models of learning that we've actually experienced in the past. So the education system has changed, but a lot of the time the people that are in the role of workplace learning designers and developers are actually in a spot where they might have been out of the education system for a period of time. So they're actually copying models that are sometimes quite out of date. And then that's that spot where we sort of copy these sort of information dumps. It's interesting. I've got to confess, run webinars, which I talk at people. It's a little bit of an information dump. There is sometimes an interaction, but I revert to it very quickly. So let's have a quick interaction to try to break some of that. When you do see a creative learning solution, what does it look like? I'm really interested to see what that sort of, some of the words, I really wrestled with this question, by the way, because I was like, what do I say? What does the creative learning solution feel like? And I went, oh, that's going to be too hard, but that's almost what I'm after, is that sort of sense of when you come across something, you sit there and go, actually, that is creative. What does that sort of look like? How does it feel to you? Could you please put your thoughts in chat? It's interesting. It's one of those things where sometimes it takes a few moments for, I think, people to warm up with some of these things and have a bit of a think. And I find myself, cool, David, yeah, it's focused on the learner engagement. Actually, a big statement, by the way, but David, lots of layers to that. And it stretches you. Oh, 80-20 ratio, 80 of the time for the learners. Actually, Mark, that's also interesting. Quite often we in lots of different things, we talk about the things that are sort of simple and elegant. Ruth, yeah, learners bring their own involvement, their own experience to it. It's interesting, Olivia, you've gone for that simple and clear as well. We'll actually do a webinar sometime about this whole engagement word as well, because I think there's some really interesting things to depack on that as well. Cool. Thank you for the people who've done a few things on the whiteboard as well. I just try and move those around to. Right, for reflection, a safe space. Give someone an aha moment. It's fun. All right. Okay. So I'm going to do that moment where I sit there and open up to a group of people and then sit there and go, well, these are some of the things I think is when I see some of them. And some of what you've talked about, I think, being sort of surprising, different, and simple and engaging. It's sort of some of what I see as the of it. It's actually an interesting word that I find myself when I think about creative solutions to most things in the world, that I find myself using the word, and I've got one of those moments everyone has used Zoom where I've lost my mouse across my multiple screens. It's often novel. And novel is a really interesting word. It's actually that sense of it's something different to what you've seen in the past. Someone sort of talked about the fact that quite often it surprises them, and it surprises them in a different way. So I think this is one of the core things about this word that we're going to spend a little bit of time depacking, called creativity. It's actually quite often there's this novelty factor to it. The engagement bit comes from the fact it is novel. Our brains sit there and do a little bit of a whole, this is different. Haven't seen this before. oh, I might need to pay attention to this. This is unusual. Ah, okay, all right. So I might, this is something I thought I knew, but then all of a sudden, actually, this has been shown in a different way, and you have this sort of, it sparks a sort of curiosity in you in a really different and a really interesting way. I find myself when I'm talking about, and when I was doing the prep work for this, sometimes talking about the mind and brain. I realized I actually sometimes talk about things, particularly around creativity and design, which I don't have the evidence for, by the way. It made me realize. I sat there and went, and done a bit of work around neuroscience and learning, but I haven't done neuroscience and creativity. So it was, if I say some of these things, it's more not from an evidence base, it's more from a observation base. One thing I do find is quite often things that do have this sort of novelty factor to them, or have some sort of concept theme. Or recently in a program, someone said, oh, it's the hook, it's the thing that's a sort of hook to it. I said I've mentioned the podcast a number of times, and it's really lovely podcast that I will probably talk about a couple of times with Daniel Wallace. We're actually talking about learning videos. Daniel comes from a really strong advertising background. So she actually sort of talked about the fact that to actually make a really engaging learning video, you needed this strong creative concepts and strong creative theme to really drive it forward in a very different way. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the sort of techniques. She sat there and went, well, back when I was an advertising executive, this is the way we used to work to build the concepts, and how she then started to apply those to learning as well. Interesting for a couple of reasons. This podcast has actually ended up being the most listened to learning way working podcast that we have. And I think it's actually because Danielle has pushed it as well. And there was a moment where I didn't release many. So it's in that spot where it is actually one of the most popular ones ever. A little bit on this whole marketing thing, and then what happens in an advertising agency. Because quite often people, and I quite often use it as a metaphor of a really strong creative engine. And we actually quite often think about the creativity in, say, advertising coming from, say, the graphic designers or the copywriters. For the people who are graphic designers here and copywriters or come from that background, please don't let what I'm about to say bag you out too much. Quite often it's a collaborative process. Diana's smiling because she's actually one of our graphic designers who's crossed the line to being more of a learning person. It's actually quite often a collaborative process, but it's led by the strategist. So the person who's actually quite often putting the hook together and in developing the concept is the person who's looking at the business needs and sitting there going, well, the business needs, the audience needs, the market needs all align around this type of concept, and this is the type of position we need. And then the actual creatives do the implementation of those particular ideas right through those things. So it's this sort of point that it comes from the strategy rather than actually this end point to sit there and go, not just about the layout of the graphics or photography or the words you're using, but it's actually at this other end of the strategist is where it's being driven from. Now, you've heard me talk about this word creativity. And we use this word in a really interesting way. I'm going to work through this in a bit of a different way. As someone who's both, I almost think of myself as this sort of freeform creative on the left-hand side, this sort of artist, and then the other side, this very applied design type of thinking, which is very much about problem solving and innovating. I actually wrestled with that where innovation goes, by the way, everyone. But sometimes we actually associate creativity almost too much with what's on the left-hand side. I think it's actually, when I've talked to scientists that are doing research, quite often they've talked about their process, especially when they're working with real unknowns, is actually almost being this same type of creative process that I've experienced as a creator as well. So the tools and things on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side, are the things that are really interesting to us as learning designers. I think we quite often, and we've got quite good in learning design as being problem solvers, and looking at problems. It's not one of our weaknesses is this thing of actually starting to see ourselves almost as a business focused creative area as well, which is then why we sometimes have the engagement problem that goes along with that. Now, when you're being creative, and there's lots of people who on that bar went up to the 2/3, what does it sort of start to feel like when you're being creative? What's the sort of words that you actually start to sort of sit there and think about? Because this is this sort of I'm trying to hint at, trying to explore with the group what the mindset of being creative actually is. Can I just take this as a moment to quickly mute myself and take a quick drink where people get their responses right. Some people exciting, inspirational, motivated, energized. The key interesting is always quite often a positive word rather than a negative words as well. State of flow. Excited, motivated. That Tanya is actually a client and she's in a similar spot to me. She comes from a similar background and moved into very, very different areas. Jessie, it's interesting. That's a really interesting one as well. And quite often we do use metaphors of boxes when we talk about creativity, because that's a sense of like, well, actually flow is quite often an uncomfortable spot where you're actually pushing yourself forward and you're going to a next spot. Um, that's interesting as well about the frustration you can feel as well. Because I think this is the other thing is people sit there and do a whole, well, this is fun work. Not always, sometimes quite challenging, not always easy to do, to do as well. Cool. Visualizing the people, how they might solve it, hopefully narrativizing it. That's a really nice thing. Cool. I think it's sort of interesting as we pick out some of those themes. It's that sense of things about the fact that you're excited about what you're doing, you're in flow, moving to new spaces, and those new spaces are sometimes uncomfortable as well. So it's that spot of where you're moving forward, but it's not always actually easy to move forward is probably the best way to put it. But as you start to do that, it gets to a very different type of experience. So clear the drawings and move on to the next slide. Now, interested in putting a mark for you against this gauge about whether or not you think the barriers to being more creative in your work as a learning designer or a learning person, whether or not it's your organizational culture or it's actually your stakeholders or yourselves. And someone actually went, yep, cool. Actually, that's interesting. Time limits. Yes, sometimes you don't actually have time. Content, culture. Interesting. Because this is what I was expecting as well, with a distribution as well across this, because essentially the It is actually one of those things where you sit there and do a whole, not always about your content. It's sometimes about your organizational culture. The content and organization culture is sometimes incredibly mixed together as well, by the way, just a few people have seen working through that. It's interesting about the time limit. Probably another thing is that sometimes, as people said, sometimes when something's creative, it's actually quite simple. So the really elegant design solutions are sometimes things are actually really quite, if you can nail it, they're not complicated. I'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques I use a little bit later in the brainstorming things where I actually sit there and go, okay, if we go out to no limits, what can we do? And then that sometimes opens up really interesting things that are actually in a very different spot as well. As you've written up what those types of barriers are for yourself, could you please just take on a sort to sit there and go, okay, so it's this type of barriers I'm dealing with, because the next activity, we're just going to do a little bit of a sharing of what might be some of the ways of getting over some of those some of those things. So I'm going to clear my screen, or clear all of our screens, and then move on to the next activity. First half of this webinar, by the way, is very activity heavy, and then we will move into a little bit more content. So I promise you, I won't completely burn you out by spending the next half an hour actually keeping on doing this intensive activities as well. Cool. So what could be some of the ways we can overcome some of those barriers? So if some of those people who sat there went, okay, we've got a limitation of time, which is partly to do with content and our stakeholders. How can we get to that as well? Ruth, yeah, uncomplicated sometimes can actually be in a spot where it does just take time to work through the elegant, the spot. Where put to leave the organization, there was a really interesting story, someone who worked in a very structured organization, and they had to be structured. And he actually made the comment that he was actually in an organization that everyone needed to be fit into, they needed to be square pegs to fit into square holes, and that's what they needed to do. And it was actually, they were essentially and then he was more round. And the way he actually did it, he left the organization. He sat there and went, this isn't the right organization for me. Cool communication, collaboration, yeah, range of tools beyond brainstorming, because that sometimes really puts people off. As I started Sprout Labs in 2007, there was a moment where, and I think I got the quote a little bit later on, the quote on the Fast Company magazine was that the Master of Fine Arts was a new MBA. I actually sat there and went, okay, so I'm going to do some of this stuff that I've been doing with my learners and my team around design thinking. And there was particularly a moment where someone sat down and said to me, design thinking, what's that? When it's this process to do with applying innovation processes to these things. And I realized that particularly that time, it wasn't a term that people were familiar with. So I stopped using it for about, actually it was probably about 10 years. And then when it became more commonly used in organizations, I started to use it again, even with that particular person who actually questioned me at that particular moment as well. So lots of things that are interesting here. Essentially, it's about the barriers are about communication, finding the right way to talk to people about things. I think it's sort of interesting. I'm going to sit there and say, probably sitting there going, we want to find a really creative solution to this. In a lot of organizations, isn't going to get you much traction. It could actually put on some of your stakeholders quite a lot. So really thinking through that you're communicating and you're thinking they're going, okay, we want to build a really engaging type of learning experience. So we need to involve the learners in a different way in our process. And we're going to explore a number of different types of techniques as well with this. What I'm hinting at with what I'm talking through here with the communication strategy is one of the best ways of going about sort of introducing more ideas around the creativity into our design processes is actually working with design thinking. Because it provides us a process to overcome some of these barriers. The communication one's really interesting. And what I've seen in many organizations is the L&D and HR area is the last to the table design thinking. That quite often is actually the spot where naturally part of the marketing area. But the product and the service areas are starting to do it. They're sitting there going, well, we need to make sure we're aligned to what our clients need, so they're putting into place. So then when in actual fact, the learning people start to get to this spot where they sit there and go, actually, we want to work in a different way. We want to build different types of solutions. They can actually tap in to the culture of design thinking that have been developed in other parts of the business as well. And because those other parts of the business are literally leading the future, it becomes just a really nice way of doing this as well. So that communication piece changes really differently, because you're sitting there going, well, in actual fact, we're just really doing what the service design people over in such and such are doing. We're applying those same processes, so same processes we're using for working for our clients to our internal people as well. Do you realize as we're shifting our culture, we're helping them become more clients focused as well? So it's an interesting one. I had wrestled with sequencing here, by the way. So this word design thinking, generally accepted as a process and mindset for creative problem solving. So it has the creative word in it and the problem solving to it. It was pioneered as a type of way of working by IDO. IDO used to be a pure product design company. So they basically did the product design for the first Apple laptop, the first Apple mouse. So they were in a spot where they've led the way through it. And I actually refer to them a couple of times because they put out a lot of really interesting things around design thinking now as well. How is this process of design thinking different to our traditional type of approaches in terms of ADDIE approaches or learning design approaches? Just going to pick up a couple of things, just partly because they were things people talked about as well. It's learner-centered. It involves the learner at the core of it. Sometimes learners are actually co-designing them. It's extremely good when you have an ill-defined problem. When you sit there and go, we've got a business problem and we're not quite sure how to solve it. We don't think that the actual capability problem is going to be solved by a course solution alone. So it opens up possibilities rather than closing them down. It's also, if you do it really well, it becomes very iterative and very experimental to then figure out the processes behind it, behind what really works as well. And as I said before, it's actually both a process and a mindset. So I'm going to show what the process is, and I use slightly different words than what, say, the IDO people use. So it starts with this notion of understanding, it's analyzing bit. Then IDO talks about ideation. We've decided to use the word exploring. Part of this communication piece with the client. It's actually an easier word on people. Let's do a workshop that explores what the possible ideas could be, rather than let's do an ideation workshop. People go, what are you talking about? And then prototyping, trying to build it, getting feedback and testing. The other thing is that I think this is really important for our work, is to always be evolving and continuously improving. So it goes back into this spot where you go into evolving to then understand what the approach is looking like, to then try to refine it as well. So it becomes like not a linear process, it's a continuous looping around process as well. The mindset's interesting. Less people have done work on the mindset. During the podcast series, I had the pleasure of having a conversation with a couple of the team members from a design thinking agency in Melbourne called Huddle. And their CAO had done some work around this. I'm not going to read this out. I'm going to talk about a really interesting question. Because I was thinking about it as I was hunting this out. I sat there and went, what was the question they asked about this? And I went, actually, what's the most challenging mindset? And it was actually, and I think the answer, and the answer was, I think I know the answer was liquid mind. That ability to sit there and go, we thought we were going to be doing A, but through the process of understanding our learners in a different way, we're going to be going off and doing B, and we might actually also explore whether or not C is going to work. So that sort of thing of being able to be open to things. People talked about that sort of thing of being excited about things in a different way. And that often comes with that sort of moment where you can start to become a little bit more fluid with things as well. Cool. Ah, cool. Interesting one about the prototypes is actually artifacts, not just descriptions. Prototypes in learning and development is another big topic. I don't think I've actually got qualified to talk about because I haven't actually figured it out completely. So actually, I'm going to avoid talking about the prototypes, by the way. I'm going to dive into something I think we've actually we're getting better at, which is understanding, and then just a bit on exploring around brainstorming as well. Just going to be talking for a little while for everyone as well, and showing a few tools. But one of the things that's different for us in learning is we've got this thing where we've got a threefold thing we need to understand: the business problem, the learners, as well as the context we're working in. Especially if you're people like me who are coming in new to an organization, need to understand the cultural situations people are working in as well. When I think about understanding, I think about these three different aspects in quite a holistic way. We are getting better as a profession in this analysis phase and understanding. I think this is one of the things over the last 5 years we have really moved forward in a really different way to what we were before. Think about some of this as being in the shoes of. Sometimes very easy as in a spot where you move from being a expert, a performer in an organization to being a instructional designer, and in that organization where you sort of know what it's like to be a learner, you know what it's like to be a performer. It's always a spot. There's actually someone who in the group, I'm just thinking about, I'm going to say him because you might recognize him. So he sort of came from worked in a customer service background, and he just had a really nice spot where he'd moved from customer service into instructional design and understood it really well. And he moved into a radically different organization with a radically different culture. And he did this really beautiful job of actually sitting there going, I'm just scanned for a little while to really understand how the organization is working to build up that sense of empathy for people. One of the tools that are used is empathy maps. So essentially sitting there working through with a learner of how are they hearing, how are they seeing, what are they thinking, what's the pains and gains for them through things. So one particular group I was working with, someone sat there and went, okay, I'm going to actually sit with a group of learners over a period of 2 or 3 days and watch what they're doing and type up and actually literally scribble up their empathy maps as they're working through it. Fishbone diagrams are one of those things where quite often used for analyzing root causes. Paul Matthews has written a number of books, including a really nice one on informal learning, uses slightly and capability development. It uses one that actually sometimes actually has some labels on them. I think these are nice prompts rather than actually starting with something discussed with no prompts at all to come into actually on your fishbone diagram to sit there and go, cool, all right, so we're going to talk about the skills that people need and the mindsets and the knowledge, what processes are they going to have to follow and how are we going to measure this, just to be able to workshop this in a structured way. A series of, let me introduce this. What am I? most treasured actual objects in my world is a book of ID cards from IDO. And these are just 3 of them. So essentially quite often when I'm starting to sit there and go, cool, we're starting a project, wonder what might be the best way about going about understanding or starting to experiment. I pick up these cards and start to sort of shift through them to sit there and go, which ones are going to be the ones that might work for this particular thing. They're physical, so they've got this really lovely tangible thing to them as well. It's a little bit, some of them are, when you sit there and go, cool, that's just really nice, solid analysis work. Some of them are a little bit more lateral, like draw the experience. One of the ones I've never been able to use was Potty Store, where you essentially get people to position themselves in a possible new space to be able to do a bit of a prototype of something. So I've never been able to use that, which that's that whole trying to build an artifact. That was actually trying to build it by actually people moving around the space. Now, how about time? A bit to do on exploring, but this is a spot where we're sort of thinking about, so when we understand what our learners need, we understand what the business needs, and then we're going into a spot where we're exploring what the possible solutions might be. On a quick chat, not a very long one, not long one, is what are the challenges with brainstorming? Cool. And could you hunt out the IDO method cards yourself, Ruth? Just interested to hear what some of your thoughts about the challenges on brainstorming actually are. Cool. Yep. Groupthink's interesting. Groupthink can also, as a consultant, be used for power to actually get people together. Time and management. Oh yeah, extroverts take over. And that's one of the things I do. Actually, as a participant, I find really challenging because if I don't have trust with the group, I'll naturally become an introvert. Try to justify. Yep. Justification, that whole I've got my idea, and then you have holders in it. To me, safe ideas because of the group dynamics. Cool. I'm going to keep on moving. Thank you. I do use brainstorming. I really am cautious of it, partly because of some of the things people have actually talked about, the whole group dynamics, who's the people in the room, the groups thinking. So I'm very fond of doing things with a group of people, but I think it needs quite often a lot more structure than what we get from brainstorming. Sorry, I keep on clicking on my wrong windows. Let's explore a few alternatives to brainstorming. Techniques can be used both by yourself as well as in group as well. My first genuine advice is it needs to be visual. Your brain, your visual part of your brain functions in a holistic way compared to the language bits of your brain. So if you're in a spot where you can make it visual and in some ways, and it doesn't have to be physical, it's whiteboarding tools like Miro, which is actually one of my favorite ways of doing some of this work now because it's so collaborative with a group of people. But it just needs to have visual to trigger different types of working and thinking in your brain. One of the most powerful things to be able to do is to bring 2 things together, to sit there and go, I know this sounds really odd to sit there and go. So with this particular learning program, what happened if at the core of it was about coffee? I love coffee, by the way. So it's actually a really classic one because everyone then laughs because they possibly by that stage seen me three short blacks and doing a whole how is he functioning after so much coffee. So you actually bring different things into it. Or if we brought the cactus in, how could we actually organize these things? So it's this moment where the brainstorming sometimes brings together things where you start to have this group thinks with it. So what you start to do is actually bring together new connections. It in the first book IDEO wrote on their processes, they talked about these inspiration cabinets that they had around the space. So what they would actually do is actually have this sort of these boxes of random objects that quite often the designers, when they were working on ideas, would just go to, pick up 5 objects and then sit there and go, this particular thing, this car seat, wonder what I can learn from this shell that I've got in my hand. So it just sort of opens up different things in a different way. There's a number of variations and things around how you brainstorm. There's particularly a chance for me to talk about one that gets called brain writing, where, and there's versions of this where everyone writes down their ideas. So you will actually find, even if you do a standard brainstorming, if people actually have a chance to write down their ideas beforehand, they actually have better ideas. This one's really nice because you actually silently pass it on to the next person, who then passes it on to the next person. So everyone starts to see the ideas in a quiet mode. And then they spot, then they all come, then you come together almost as after everyone's seen all the actual ideas as well. So this becomes a really nice spot to be able to sort of change some of those dynamics as well. Cool. And yeah, and then another alternative to this is the spot where you actually get people to group sketch something. Someone, you give a piece of paper that you almost hand around, or multiple pieces of paper that you're handing around, where you actually in a spot where people are drawing something together. Notice I'm still talking about this as a group activity. So some of these things do work really well as a group. The next one is one that actually I personally find I use some of these types of techniques when I'm by myself. And they do tell, and it's structured as Scamper. So someone was talking about that sense of blockages that we sometimes all have in our thinking. So it's this whole moment where you sit there and go, if we removed ... what would happen? The most controversial questions I keep on asking is, if we didn't do any training, formal training, what would happen? After a bit of kicking and screaming in the group, I normally get some really interesting ideas about workplace and learning in the work of flow. So it's also almost this whole thing of sitting there going, you've got something, how can we actually look at this in a different way by substituting, combining, adapting? I find these quite, I would never walk through each one of them. I sometimes actually have them on a piece of paper where I sit there and go, which one do I need to use in this particular spot as well? Another couple that would be really nice, and there's lots of versions of this. So wishing is a really interesting one. With that time budget thing, I actually quite often use this. What would happen if we had unlimited time and unlimited budget? And it's interesting because essentially it opens up to remove that. And then quite often what actually happens is you then step away and sit there and go, well, we can't do ... but we could do this other thing, which is more simple, elegant, and actually has some of those nice sort of features that people were talking about. So it becomes a sort of like what would happen. The other one I use that I find really useful in terms of wishing is a whole, what would happen if this was a computer game? And that's always triggers really different types of thinking in a group as well. Even sometimes that doesn't actually end up being a game. It just ends up loosening people's thoughts. So all of a sudden it doesn't become so much of an information dump. Iona and I had a bit of a debate for a document of this one. So I'm actually talk about this in a different way. This is a personal strategy I use as well. How would person solve this? How would I sort of visualize someone and sit there and go, if they had this problem, how would they think about this? How would such and such think about this? And it's really interesting because it gets me totally out of my whole body and brain to sit and go, oh yeah, okay, so they'll think about it in this particular way, or they'll think about it in this particular way. I think that's a really powerful way to actually, when you're blocked, to be able to release yourself from it as well, in your situation from it as well. Cool. Oh God. Yeah. A quick activity, and Paul's actually interestingly started to articulate into this as well. What's some of the sorts of what do some of these types of approaches have in common to them? I'm just going to pause for a moment and not talk for a moment while we start to get some of the ideas up. Look, I've done a short Lego workshop, everyone, Alan and Michael, and I found it really interesting. But the physicality of it was really, really interesting, how quick it was. Cool. You're getting out of your routine. Actually, I'm going to pick up Paul, because I actually think a lot of what the core of a lot of these techniques is actually about change. You sit there and you go, I normally think about this in this particular way. How can I change it to something else? So it's actually techniques that are really around changing or shifting what you're looking at. Yeah. Cool. Okay, I'll keep on working, moving forward to make sure I catch up a little bit of time. Now, in the last section, structure is God, which is one reason why I actually think the whole brainstorming thing, we burn out really quickly and doesn't work particularly well, because in actual fact, quite often as a whole, here's a whiteboard. Let's bounce some different ideas. And I found when I used to do it to start with, it always spent too much time on it. So having this strong structure of, let's do some of these other techniques like the brainwriting one, and then let's start to talk about how we're going to prototype them and rate them and think about them, all within a period of sort of not hours, of like 10 minutes. Cool. Finding inspiration. Inspiration is a really interesting word. For a couple of reasons. At the moment, I'm finding myself using it a lot with the team. It's about a word where you look at something and you don't copy it. You sit there and you go, what do I learn from this to be able to do something else? And it's actually that sort of, what do I learn from it? How does it trigger something else that's powerful? One of the things I keep on finding, when I ask people what they want from webinars, or why do people go to conferences, it's a whole, oh, I want examples and case studies of actually what people have done in the past. I wouldn't look for what other people have done in the past, but your learning solutions in your situations, because your learners, your business context and business outcomes are totally different. And you're still within the box of learning. I strongly encourage you not to look at more learning. So Danielle, in her podcast, actually does talk about that. So she talks about the fact that that quite often just the whole way that they would actually, when they sat there, okay, so we have to think through a concept for something for a learning experience. Let's go for a walk. Let's move. The diversity of things just so important. Talking to someone different or doing something different as well. So it's this whole sort of thing. It's interesting because essentially we looked at that thing of when the brainstorming techniques were about changing the way we look at things, also finding inspirations and about looking at things differently. The couple of ideas about what you could do, and this, by the way, has a little bit of a whole flavor around the spot where I don't think half of Australia is in lockdown anymore, but a lot of it is in lockdown, and we are restricted about where we can move, about things we can do in our own homes. So we have what we normally do, and then there's all the things that you can actually do that might shift the way you think. Even just that whole thing of stopping looking at Netflix in terms of what's been recommended to you. I got quite distracted, by the way, when I sat there and went, where's Airbnb online experiences at? And doing a whole, there's a series of places I would love to travel to again. And I haven't been able to again. Cool. Ada, yeah, Austin Keelan's, I actually get excited because essentially I'll sit there and say all of his books are absolutely fantastic in terms of creating, sharing, and thinking. They're really short reads, everyone, tiny, small things, very articulate, highly visual, and they're a really nice thing to be able to latch onto. Thank you for sharing that. It was one of those things I didn't even think about. As a bit of a wrap up, I did think about doing a whole planning tool for this. What are you going to do differently after this webinar? So I just want you to consider and share in chat. What are you personally going to do differently? Maybe next time you come to working on your next learning experience, what are you going to do differently? And also, I strongly encourage you to open up these possibilities in multiple parts of your life as well. It's actually not just about that sense of, if you start to become that fluid, liquid mind in your personal life, you'll find it easier in your professional life as well. One of the things that's interesting about sharing some of these things is sometimes, cool, Nicole, yep, actually, I think in your particular situation, in your context, Scamp is a great set of tools. Really, really good. Cool. Karen, developing your curiosity, which is a cool, hey, trying a different alternative to brainstorming. In different ways. The other cards, if anyone's interested in them, I couldn't quite figure out how to really weave them in, is a series of cards called the Oblique Strategies from Brian Eno and Peter Snitchell from the 70s. They are a little bit more lateral than what the IDO ones are, so not everyone clicks with those ones as well. Cool, asking different people for different inputs. Diversity when you're working with a group of things as well. So I repeatedly see and feel in myself go back to what I'm comfortable with. It's interesting. Some of the things that I'm comfortable with is actually what sometimes people see as being innovative and creative. And I sit there and go, oh no, can't do that again. I've used that metaphor before. We can't do that map. We can't make a navigated environment. Done that multiple times. So it's interesting because essentially your tolerance for some of those things works as well. Cool. Oh, so Ruth, you found a copy of them. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're just on time. If you're really interested in having a conversation about how you rework your way that your design team works, please get in contact. We do, as I've talked about a couple of times, work with different organizations, mentoring them through design thinking processes and learning as well. Hour's gone really quickly, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out to spend an hour thinking about this and being with me and being great participants in chat, everyone. Have a great day. Iana and I will stay online for a little while as well. Just if you've got any questions, you want to take the microphone at all. And Paul, yes, I should do a whole session on prototype one day.